Welcome back to Taiwan versus the world. As our dear country remains in the spotlight, we are going to clarify what its internal politics actually look like by giving the floor to two people who have explored them from the inside. But first, we'll have a conversation with two guests joining us live from Europe about how China is trying to turn the continent against Taiwan and how Europe is resisting. It's a timely and insightful update on European resilience in the face of Chinese pressure. China doesn't seem eager to stop its pressure on democracies when it comes to Taiwan, and we see it still, especially in Europe. We are going to discuss today with two people who have witnessed it, Zsuzsa Ferenczy and Matej Simalcik. Zsuzsa and Matej, hello.
Hi.
Thanks for having us. Hi.
It's great to be here.
I would ask you both first if you can introduce yourself.
Sure. Perhaps I go first. My name is Zsuzsa Ferenczy. I work on EU-Taiwan relations in particular, but I look at the regional dynamics in the Indo-Pacific, obviously with a focus on China as well, but Southeast Asia. And I am currently based in Brussels working as a visiting fellow at the Martin Center. And I continue my work from Brussels, but connecting, I guess, Europe and Taiwan through this angle.
My name is Matej. I'm the Executive Director of Central European Institute of Asian Studies. I work mostly on two topics. First being Europe-China relations and looking at issues related to China's influence in Europe, either through FIMI campaigns, so that would be foreign information manipulation and interference, or also looking at issues related to economic security and how economic relations can be conduit of influence. And secondly, but in no way less importantly, I also do a lot of work on Europe-Taiwan relations. I spent the whole last year in Taiwan as a visiting fellow in one of the Taiwanese think tanks, and now I'm back in Europe working from my home institute on these topics.
Thank you. And so you are in a good position to tell us what is China doing in Europe about Taiwan, what kind of pressure or grazon warfare. And we have a hook here to start because I believe it is you, Zsuzsa, who commented on something that happened, apparently published by The Guardian. Chinese officials who were trying to pressure some European countries, member of the Schengen Agreement, to not let Taiwanese politicians enter the Schengen area, which, as a reminder, is the part of Europe where you can circulate without needing a visa. Zsuzsa, maybe do you want to tell us a bit what you learned about this event, what happened?
Sure. So it's a very interesting story, perhaps. Is not interesting is not the right word. So let me just get into it. I was contacted by the Guardian's Taipei-based correspondent, Helen Davidson, concerning a story that she was writing on back in December, which goes like this. So apparently, Chinese officials have approached a good dozen of member states of the European Union and try to put pressure on these countries with their own interpretation of European legislation when it comes to border controls. So you you mentioned Schengen, the Schengen Agreement, which indeed is the Schengen area is a system of open borders within the EU. Where member states have abolished border controls at their common borders. But it is an area that the EU has established in order to facilitate movement. And also it is an area that for outside travelers requires an entry. And that's regulated at the EU level between the EU and member states. So basically, a long story short, the idea of And the interpretation of the Chinese officials, of those that approached European embassies, as I am told, and I was told at the time, was that their interpretation basically of their own laws is not correct, because by allowing Taiwanese people entering the EU and the EU Schengen area actually puts the EU's relationship with third countries, in this case China, at risk, because these Taiwanese persons put the EU's relationship with China at risk. So this is something, again, I was not in direct contact with this story unfolding. So what you hear from me is what I heard as this was presented to me at the time. And I will not give you a comprehensive picture of the background because I am not aware of those details. So all I can tell you is the information I was presented with and my own interpretation of what this means for us as EU member states and as the EU in managing our relationship with China as well as with Taiwan. So perhaps I can mention, to my knowledge, the countries that were approached were Belgium, the Czech Republic, Poland, the Netherlands, Italy, Austria, Germany, Lithuania, Denmark, Estonia, and Ireland. Again, this is the list that I got from the press. And so perhaps what I can, just as a first reaction, share with you was my reaction at the time. So a funny story was that when I got this message, I was actually on a plane flying from Taipei to Europe because I spent some time in Taipei in December, and this is part of my ongoing research and also my focus on how these dynamics are evolving and the pressure campaign that is picking up from China on Europe and on Taiwan. So my first reaction was that this is surprising, but at the same time is not entirely surprising because it fits into China's pressure campaign, which is to come up with new and also creative ways to put pressure on Europeans to try to undermine their willingness to engage Taiwan and to isolate Taiwan. So the big aim is to isolate Taiwan diplomatically, and even to suggest, as again I was told, is that the EU should follow the UN's example of not allowing Taiwanese officials to enter any European government buildings. So using the EU's own legislation when it comes to border management and providing their own interpretation with a twist to the Europeans on their own legislation, I find that an extremely bold move and also very creative in the sense of coming up, like I said, with new ways to put pressure on the Europeans. And second, and I will stop here, is what it comes down to is, I would say, an attempt to interfere in the Europeans' sovereign policy decision-making process. And I think it is an interference in the way the EU manages its relations with China. And the irony in this is that for China and for the PRC, Beijing, it treats Taiwan as a domestic affair, and it does not allow any interference, is what they describe as any country doing any sort of cooperation with Taiwan is seen in Beijing as an interference. So Beijing on its end, trying to tell Europeans by interpreting European legislation and border regulation in this case on how to manage our relations with Taiwan, I find this as a bold interference in how we manage our relations with Taiwan.
Zsuzsa and Matej, please feel comfortable. We don't ask any of you to go any further than the information you received. And we know all of this is, of course, sometimes very difficult to identify. So you are welcome, of course, to work on the information that is available to us. Matej, the same. If you want to, please give your opinion.
I largely agree with what how Zsuzsa has described the situation. Let me maybe just contextualize some of the things. First of all, I think it's important to mention that what is the context of current EU-Taiwan relations when this China's pressure campaign to stop travel of Taiwanese officials to Europe has happened. Our analysis has shown that over the past several years, we are now in record volumes of mutual visits of Taiwanese officials and European officials in between Europe and Taiwan. Between 2019 and 2024, this volume has increased approximately sixfold, right? So a very sharp increase in mutual interactions between Europe and Taiwan, to which China is reacting. Of course, it is within sovereign right of Europe to decide who it engages with, what kind of legal conditions it puts on this engagement, and how it approaches its own migration and visa policies, right? That is not for any other external actor to decide. This is for Europe to decide on its own. But of course, China is reacting to this huge development of and mutually beneficial development of Europe-Taiwan relations, which, as Zsuzsa has mentioned, China sees unfortunately as interference in its own domestic affairs. In terms of how China is reacting, I think it's very interesting to know that this is yet another example of China to trying to deploy tactics of lawfare on relations with external partners and trying to preclude them from interacting with Taiwan. This is something that China is doing for quite a while, but of course, it's the specific tactics and techniques are evolving, right? When we are talking of China's lawfare against Taiwan, this is usually what we are usually thinking about is China's reinterpretations of UN resolutions that expelled Taiwan from the organization. But in this case, China is moving further, and it is trying to interpret domestic regulations of Europe in a way that would be favorable to China. And let's say this is something that, of course, China has no jurisdiction over. Only European countries, European judicial organs have this competence to decide what is and what is not against our own regulations. The tactic of using or promoting its own legal interpretations, it's not necessarily new in Europe. We know of past instances, for example, in Czech Republic, where Huawei was trying to circulate in the past interpretations of Czech cybersecurity laws in light of warnings against using Huawei's technologies in 5G and critical infrastructure by the Czech cybersecurity regulator. So this is a little bit reminiscent of that to me. And I think it's also interesting to note the selection of countries which were targeted by this campaign by China. The two of them really stand out to me in this group. First, Czech Republic. Second, Lithuania. Two countries that are one of the most active engagers of Taiwan. But at the same time, also, this is happening with regards to Czechia at the time when the Czech government is going through a transition after elections, right? And there are signals coming out from the new Czech government that they want to somewhat normalize ties with China, while saying that they are not planning to sacrifice the relationship with Taiwan, but they want to restore some of the channels of communication and basic interactions with China. So Beijing might see this as an opportunity to push through some more changes in the behavior that it would like to see. And we will need to see maybe in a few months how this plays out and to what extent the new Czech government is succumbing to this either pressure coming from China or inducements from China, because we know that China likes to use both as in its arsenal, both sticks and carrots when it comes to motivating changes in other countries' behavior.
Yes, just like you, Matej, I also took note when Shusha was listing the countries that both the Czech Republic and Lithuania were targeted. That was quite significant. Another thing before we go deeper into it that comes to my mind is the idea of telling Europe pretty much not to let Taiwanese officials in the country, not like any Taiwanese, just like the officials, like the big shots. And immediately I remember the visit of Vice President Xiao Kim to Brussels and how she got to make a speech at the European Parliament. Now, this speech was a bit overhyped. It was an organization who rented a room. It's not like she addressed the parliament itself, but still, do you think that this caused China to react this way because the way it is made, like you say, like trying to mirror what happens at the UN, that you cannot enter official buildings? Do you think that they are trying to react to this and prevent this from happening again?
Yeah, I would say that this is one reason, right? I mean, there's also the question of recent diplomatic blitz by Foreign Minister Lin Chialong, who visited many European countries on his autumn tour of Europe, right? So I think both of these are factoring into this attempts by China to limit Europeans' engagements with Taiwanese officials. But of course, the speech by Vice President Xiao Kim on the floor of European Parliament, even though not on any official European business, but a meeting of IPEC, was seen as something very very symbolic, both in Taiwan and as well as in China, right? So Beijing wants to preclude this type of behavior from happening ever again. If I would have to judge whether this is going to be effective vis-a-vis the European Parliament, for example, my guess would be that it's not going to be very very effective, because we've seen China trying to target and silence members of European Parliament repeatedly, right? We've seen in 2021 targeted sanctions against members of the European Parliament. That didn't stop any of those targeted MEPs from being critical of China, from engaging Taiwan. Some of the MEPs, I think it was last year or maybe year before. I cannot place the date precisely right now. When they were supposed to travel for an IPEC meeting that was happening in Taiwan, were receiving letters from the Chinese missions not to travel to Taiwan, and phone calls as well. And that also was largely ineffective, I have to say. So I just see this as a continuing attempt to disrupt engagement with Taiwanese officials, both on a EU level as well as the member state level. But over the past few years, we've seen countries of Europe recognizing that relations with Taiwan can stand on their own, on its own merit, right? That there's a lot of beneficial cooperation that needs to be factored into decisions, and that means that relations with Taiwan are not so easy to sacrifice anymore in favor of relations with Beijing, especially as we see continued attempts to de-risk from China, establish supply chain cooperation with Taiwan, attract more Taiwanese investment to Europe in sensitive sectors, critical sectors like semiconductors, for example, drones, which is another emerging cooperation area. These are all the factors, I think, that we need to consider when we are talking about this recent attempt by China to interfere.
Perhaps I jump in here, speaking of the effectiveness of the pressure campaign, because we've seen that EU-China relations are clearly or have clearly deteriorated in the past, I would say, decade. So I followed these relations while I was working in the European Parliament between 2008 and 20. So for 12 years, my sense was, those were much better years when it comes to EU-China relations. I think a lot clearly has changed, but at the same time, EU-Taiwan relations at that time had a much lower profile. And so now in 2025, we are in a very different situation where between 2020 and 25, I think those were the most important years in bringing Taiwan much higher on the European Parliament's agenda, but also on the EU's agenda. And I actually spent those 5 years, the past five, in Taiwan, looking at this relationship from that perspective. So my assessment today is that in this current state of affairs, I do see the European Parliament having played an increasingly important role, and this stays. This is, well understood, I think, in Beijing. This is why we see Beijing oppose European Parliament resolutions that support Taiwan. I mean, we have a long list of unprecedented moves that the European Parliament did with courage and with very strong support in the House to support Taiwan, which included upgrading the political and economic relations with Taiwan. This was the line of the 2021 resolution that was unprecedented. This was a resolution that looked at EU-Taiwan relations, not in the context of China, but Taiwan on its own merit. And then we did see in parallel a number of delegations, official visits from the European Parliament to Taiwan. So the first one was around the same time, I believe in November 2021, which was a delegation of the special committee that looked at democracy and the fight against disinformation. And this was a delegation that kind of set the stage for coming delegations, because after that, we had the Foreign Affairs Committee. Just last December, we had the Committee of Security and Defense, and members of that committee visit Taiwan. So basically, the point I'm making here is that Beijing knows that although the European Parliament is only one of the institutions of the EU that play a role in shaping the EU's engagement with Taiwan. And although it is not the most significant, because we do know that relations with Taiwan are decided by member states. And I do want to make that clear, that although I do speak highly and genuinely with much enthusiasm about the role of the European Parliament, we do have to stay realistic that it comes down to member states in terms of how that relationship will go forward with China and with Taiwan. But the fact that that Beijing is so upset and sensitive to these engagements from the European Parliament, it does tell us that Beijing understands also that what the European Parliament does is not insignificant, that we have broken some, or we've seen some breakthroughs, those that I mentioned previously in terms of resolutions, and having these not as a one-off, but setting precedent for the future and also being consistent about this. This is, I think, the problem that Beijing sees, that Taiwan does not become less important for Europeans, but Taiwan is actually becoming more important. And this is to be seen in the context of how we perceive China. And Matej spoke about Chinese influence operations and lawfare. And this is something actually we've worked together with Matej also in the context of what the European External Action Service does as well. So I'm bringing in another institution in addition to the Parliament, which is the EAS, the EU's diplomatic corps, that engages through its strategic communications unit in exploring ways to learn from Taiwan in terms of countering disinformation, information manipulation, foreign information and manipulation and interference, which is FIMI, as I think Matej already mentioned, which I think is not insignificant again, because it shows us in what ways, because I think both Matej and I, we keep saying that we do more with Taiwan and Taiwan has been elevated, but what does that really mean in practice? So I think for the audience, perhaps that's more of an interest to know that we do concrete collaboration in learning from each other to counter foreign information manipulation, so FIMI in this sense. And so I think I do not see this as something that can be reversed, but I do see this as something that needs constant work going forward. So how do we maintain this momentum? How do we deepen the exchange beyond FIMI? How do we go in the areas that Matej also mentioned in terms of semiconductors and drones and joint industrial collaboration? I think that's where really we need to focus. And of course, now that we are under pressure from the US when it comes to Europe's positioning, the concern I have is how do we stay focused on what matters going forward in keeping Taiwan close? And how do we make Taiwan part of this effort to become more resilient, more autonomous, and more self-reliant when it comes in particular to defense and security, and then prosperity. So in all of that, clearly Taiwan must remain a key element, and I hope that this is the case going forward.
But then, do we know also how countries themselves react to this case in particular, as far as we know? Because again, we're limited in information, but perhaps we know how did countries react to this attempt by China to make them forbid entry to some Taiwanese citizens, or to Chinese attempts at influencing them in general? Do we know how some of these countries are reacting?
I mean, if just quickly, if this is in particular reacting to these latest attempts in November, December to interfere in how Europe actually interprets its own border controls, what I saw was a few statements of pushback from, I believe I'm just looking at my notes here because we did have the spokesperson of the UK Foreign Office saying that permission to enter the UK is determined solely by our own laws and immigration rules, which apply equally to those traveling from Taiwan. And also, Norway and Finland, they did confirm that they were among those that received this so-called legal advice. And so this is, again, a case and an example of an attempt for Beijing to step up and also to threaten with retaliation. And I think Matej also mentioned the clear experience we have with the PRC in terms of using both sticks and carrots. So the threat of retaliation and the promise of reward and leveraging these two has been extremely useful for Beijing to keep the European countries close and also make sure that they understand that the more they do with Taiwan, the bigger the risk is that they will face retaliation. And we've had examples of that. But also a good example of how the promise of incentives has kept certain member states close was the launch of the 16+1 initiative. No one talks about that anymore. It's not even 16+1. It ended up in principle 14+1 because some left, as we know. But I think that's a good example to illustrate how Beijing wanted to bypass the EU. I mean, this is something that we know that Beijing does not like the EU and to deal with the EU as such, but try to deal with member states individually. So this is the divide and rule approach, and also to attract certain members and to make them kind of compete for more Chinese support or investment. And so the leveraging of retaliation threats and rewards has worked for Beijing. Of course, we are no longer in 2010 or 15. In 2025, clearly faced with the rupture in transatlantic relations, as this was described at Davos, and also a very self-confident Beijing, because the December move or this case we're discussing is clearly, to me, illustrates that we're dealing with a very self-confident Beijing that is using this opportunity to project itself globally in the global south, in the global north, as the predictable, reliable, trustworthy partner. I mean, I think clearly we have to rethink how we deal with Beijing, how we deal with threats, and incentives coming from Beijing, very mindful that our trade is very linked with China's trade, and de-risking does not mean decoupling. But I think the questions are very important to be addressed in terms of how do we go forward from here? What kind of relationship do we want to have with China? And also, where do we manage our relationship with Taiwan, and how do we manage this going forward? And how will Taiwan manage its own relationship with the EU as well as with the US in this bigger picture? So perhaps I'm zooming out, but I think it's helpful to think about the big picture to understand the importance of what the EP does as one of the EU institutions, what the EAS does, what the EU member states do, and how do we manage this together ultimately.
In terms of member states reacting to China's pressure campaigns, and I'm not necessarily talking about this particular case that we started the discussion of, but in general, we do see that there is not one single coherent response within EU, or like how to deal with these problems. One thing that's quite noticeable is that even within individual countries, different political actors would prefer to deal with this in very different ways. So opening the black box of a state is, I think, crucial as well, and looking at political ideologies of individual political actors involved in the relations, because of course, China's objections to interacting with Taiwan are not new, right? This is something that we are coming into the relationship with Taiwan with knowing this, right? What's of course changing is the volume of those objections, the intensity of those objections, but the principal objection behind this, that's something that we've known of for a long time. And we see then that certain political actors, I'm not gonna classify that in terms of political ideologies, because this can look very differently in individual states. But in most states, you see some political actors being very inclined to promoting relations with Taiwan, who are at the same time usually pretty much pro-West, pro-EU integration. In the ages before President Trump's second administration, also very much pro-US. But then you also those political actors that are, let's say, Eurosceptical, for example, much more open to engaging Russia, for example, that don't really follow or don't see any sort of value in following political values, the Western political values, and those then are much more inclined to heed China's calling and not engage in Taiwan, because they will be ideologically inclined to follow China's or to comply with China's objections, regardless of whether they are receiving any substantial inducements from China, which is also something that we, I think, need to consider, right? Like how to react to China. Is accepting all China's objections a winning strategy for an efficient relationship with China? And we see that in many cases it is not, right. I'll just maybe give a anecdotal example on this from my home country of Slovakia. Between 2020 2023, the Slovak government at the time, mostly composed of right of center political parties, was pursuing a somewhat critical policy on China, was adopting various security measures, including on economic security, but at the same time, it didn't stop interacting with China. Our concerns that we had with Chinese external behavior and domestic behavior as well were repeatedly communicated to China, right? But at the same time, economic cooperation was happening. And during this time, Slovakia has managed to negotiate two historically largest investment from Slovakia, right? Moving forward, starting in 2023, the new government or old new government of Prime Minister Fico came back to power, and he has a very different approach to China, right? He was very swiftly moving towards concluding strategic partnership with China, accepting accepting almost all demands that China, in the political sense, that China has of Slovakia. Interactions with Taiwan were reduced to almost nothing. But since then, like since 2023, or more realistically since 2024 until now, early 2026, we don't see any tangible outcomes of that very cordial approach to China that the government had, right? So that begs the question: does China respect you when you have such accommodating policy towards it, or are you going to get more out of the relationship if you are also assertive yourself and asserting your positions vis-a-vis China?
Well, Zsuzsa and Matej, thank you a lot for these clarifications. And yes, thank you for giving us an overview on what's happening in Europe.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Taiwan being in the spotlight means an abundance of coverage in the worldwide press, but that coverage is rarely, if ever, accurate. In particular, Taiwan's politics are constantly misunderstood and misrepresented. So let's talk about what its political parties really stand for. The Democratic Progressive Party, or DPP, led by President Lai Ching-te, and the Kuomintang, or KMT, which controls parliament with its third-party partners. The main difference between the two is identity, as explained by journalist Courtney Donovan Smith, who is known for his meticulous knowledge of party politics in Taiwan.
The biggest difference between the two parties is, I think, it comes down to a fundamental conception of who Taiwanese are. Obviously, with the KMT, which is often translated as the Chinese Nationalist Party, they do believe they're part of a greater China, and believe that Taiwan is part of sort of a greater Chinese whole, which of course goes back for thousands of years and has a remarkable civilization. And of course, they will lean heavily on Taiwanese generally speak Mandarin, a lot of the religious customs, cultural customs, and so on and so forth. The majority of Taiwanese follow these customs that originally came from China. Now, the DPP, of course, was founded specifically to oppose KMT nationalism, and it evolved from a purely pro-democratic party into a party that has a stronger sense of a separate Taiwanese identity from China.
This makes the KMT and the DPP difficult to understand for foreign audiences who are more accustomed to a left-right political divide. Ben Krauss is a Taiwan-based journalist who has looked into this paradox.
This left-right divide is something that I initially used to interpret Taiwan politics when I first came here and started to, try to figure out the contours between the DPP and the KMT and the Taiwan People's Party. And I just realized that in a country where everything is identity-based, right, around national identity, those left-right labels really are not the best way to understand why these political parties are disagreeing over things like pension reform or military spending. So there's the identity question, which I kind of view to be as like the roots of it all. There's other things that are not directly related to identity, where it's like, nuclear power is obviously very contentious, with the KMT being in favor of expanded nuclear power. Gay marriage was another issue that divided the parties, with the DPP mainly being the party that promoted more gay marriage, or promoted gay marriage legalization, although I believe some KMT members also supported it. On issues like pension reform, military spending, kind of being two of the big contentious ones right now. They're rooted back in this issue of national identity. So like take the pension reform issue. The KMT was obviously in control of Taiwan's government through authoritarian rule throughout much of the 20th century. And so as a consequence, many of the government members that use pension reforms are disproportionately KMT, whether it's bureaucrats or the military or the police. And it was very unsustainable, the pension allotments they were receiving. And President Tsai Ing-wen in her last term, she actually made them a lot less generous. And that was a very contentious issue. And if you look at it on the US spectrum, you'd be like, oh, the DPP, the more seemingly left party, they're the ones that are cutting pensions for government workers. That seems like a left-wing issue. And I think that goes to show how the left-right divide really doesn't explain, some of these debates, because ultimately she's cutting the pensions because that's the pensioners relying on that are not a huge part of her political base.
It really depends on the issue. And if you actually look back at what you would consider, say, for example, more left-leaning or progressive laws that have been passed, you'll find that they're roughly equally passed by each party. Now, there's certain issues where one of the two parties is a little bit stronger on than the other. For example, the DPP is much more anti-nuclear power, for example, whereas the KMT quite frequently does talk a lot more about air pollution and protecting the environment there. But then you could also turn around and say that the KMT recently, for local political gain, has been attacking solar power installations in the South, saying they're causing pollution. So really what it comes down to is that both parties originally were conceived as parties of change, parties of social progress and moving forward, but both parties also have strikingly conservative elements within them. So defining each party as left or right really doesn't capture it. You'll find that from issue to issue, over the passage of time, each party will take one side or the other on various issues, but there's not a consistent pattern when you look at it from, say, for example, a Western left-right perspective.
I think the common phrase I hear is on the question of Taiwan and China, everyone is generally, the consensus, they call it soft green, meaning they generally agree with the DPP's belief that Taiwan is its own independent country. And on issues like military spending, I believe increase in military spending to 5% of GDP generally commands very strong popular support. But then the paradox there is, why is the KMT still competitive in national elections? And I think that kind of goes in a million different directions. But one of the key insights from my understanding is that the KMT is able to dominate a lot more on the local level and kind of win more on the nuts and bolts issues. And the DPP is sometimes seen as being out of touch on affordability issues because they're too focused on this question of China and combating China on the world stage. Whereas I think Taiwan, just like many other East Asian countries, the people in Taiwan, they want to be focused on things like, rising housing costs, just affordability, jobs, normal kind of economics questions. And so I think that's kind of where the KMT, and then now the rise of the TPP, is becoming more trusted because I think some voters view the DPP as too focused on this kind of old question of, Taiwan, China geopolitics.
So if the two main parties are not really left or right, who is? The reality is that Taiwan's parties are deeply divided internally, with factions playing a prominent but complicated and ever-changing role.
The KMT has two different types of factions. One are local patronage factions, and they really were always, they were originally founded about and have always been about money and power. There's also within the KMT, there are, of course, more left-leaning people and more right-leaning people, but they don't really sort themselves into factions. Now, on the DPP side, you do have very organized national factions, but the days when they were leaned in heavily on ideological differences between the factions are pretty much gone. They're mostly about power, patronage, what positions their factions can get. There may be some lingering ideological values that each faction would try to identify itself with, but from the outside, they really look largely indistinguishable.
Before President Tsai Ing-wen's party reforms in the mid-2010s, the DPP used to be quite a bit more fractured between different ideologies, with like the sunflower kind of movement being more traditionally of the left in what we would consider in the US or in some European contexts. And then others are, kind of more in the Tsai Ing-wen camp, and they're very technocratic and they're very pro-business. And I understand that she tried to flatten some of those factional infighting divisions and really try to unite the party. And I think in the power vacuum that she left, at least within inside the DPP, I know those factions are emerging again. So the DPP and the KMT are both very big tent parties, meaning the big tent, and that they comprise many different ideologies, as long as they all agree on the general cause of national identity, with the DPP believing, obviously, they have a national identity firmly rooted in Taiwan, and the KMT that is much more associated with China. And obviously, those two identities manifest in the party's respective foreign policies as well.
One example that illustrates how difficult it is to characterize Taiwanese political parties is their attitude towards same-sex marriage. Taiwan famously became the first country in East Asia to legalize it. But that does not mean the party in power can be neatly described as a left-wing party.
On that particular issue, I think the DPP has a stronger track record, but there it's also a lot more mixed than and nuanced than I think people realize. When Tsai Ing-wen came out and when she was campaigning back in 2015, during the Pride March, she said that she personally supported marriage equality. But she chose her words very carefully. She did not say her party or her campaign supported it. She was very careful in explaining that she personally supported it. And that distinction mattered because as soon as the DPP won in a landslide, both the presidency and the legislature, they did everything they could to avoid the issue. And for a period there, there were a lot of protesters coming out against the DPP for not making any moves on this. And of course, Tsai Ing-wen at the time said things like, well, there's not enough consensus in society to move forward on the issue. Ideas were floated about a civil partnership, but the DPP basically became stuck. And then what happened is Constitutional Court ruled that it was unconstitutional to not allow marriage to same-sex couples. And then the DPP's back was against the wall. And ultimately, they did pass it with some of their members, particularly Christian members, abstaining or keeping out of it, while some KMT members did cross party lines and vote for it. So ultimately, you could say that, yes, the DPP does deserve credit for it, but they had no choice. The Council of Grand Justices, now the Constitutional Court, ordered them to do it.
And to top it all off, there is another defining feature of Taiwanese politics, a strong division between the north and the south of the country.
To me, one of the more fascinating parts of Taiwan politics is this regional divide. And I know in the United States and in many European countries, it's really the rise we've seen is between kind of cosmopolitan and urban cities and rural, with people in the cities voting for more of the economically left, socially left party, and then the rural parties voting for more socially conservative, and then as a consequence more fiscally conservative parties as well. And in Taiwan, obviously throwing that kind of left-right divide out the window, you really can't view a party's political power as, the DPP controls the cities, the KMT controls the rural area. The divide is much more as north and south. So in the north, the KMT, as a consequence of the fact that when the party settled over here after the Chinese Civil War, they came over and established, took over government power in the north in Taipei. And many KMT officials came over there. 2 million people came over in a short amount of time. And that really warped the politics. So the north is very KMT supporting. And then down in the south, and actually some of the rural areas as well, where Taiwanese is spoken more frequently and Taiwanese identity is a lot stronger, they still vote for the DPP. So it's on that issue, it's very split on identity, where in the north, when you hear a lot more Mandarin and you see a lot more signs of Mandarin, that's going to be a sign of a KMT stronghold. And then in the south, it's going to be a lot more DPP focused, because those regions just have a long-standing history of being very pro-Taiwanese national identity. Obviously, like the capital during a short period of time was in Tainan during the short-lived period of the Republic of Formosa. So the spirit of independence is I'd say very strong in the south.
I know the further south you go, you'll find a lot more. You'll find both the DPP in the countryside tends to be more conservative, but you'll also find that there's a much stronger Taiwanese identity, which is of course tied to much higher rates of speaking Taiwanese Hokkien at home. Whereas in the north, it tends to be a little bit more about money, power, but also legacy. There was a lot more investment. There was a lot more bureaucracy, government agencies, the science parks. And these were all originally were set up under the KMT. They were set up filled with people from the KMT. So the bureaucracy and even a lot of these science park mega projects, including TSMC, had a very strong Chinese nationalist influence right from the get-go. So, whereas the North has traditional and tribal loyalties to the KMT, the South also has tribal loyalties to the DPP.
On other news around Taiwan successfully carried out the first undersea test of its domestically developed submarine near Kaohsiung, marking a key milestone in its defense modernization program. In a letter to Pope Leo XIV, President Lai Ching-te stressed that attempts to change Taiwan's status through force or coercion won't bring true peace. Note that the Holy See maintains diplomatic relations with Taiwan rather than with China. And finally, Taiwan's central bank board members expressed confidence in the island's economic growth outlook, while also warning about possible risks related to a booming stock market and an AI bubble. The board left its key policy interest rate unchanged, which is seen as a cautious approach amid strong export demand and tech-led expansion. We will meet again next week for a new episode of Taiwan versus the World.